So welcome to our online webinar, Restoration and Reciprocity, digging deeper into the what, when, where, and why of biological restoration. Really looking forward to the talk today. And I will just proceed through the screen. So here's the agenda. We'll talk, after some brief introductions, we'll talk about the land acknowledgement, and then why we do this kind of work. What is biological restoration? I'm just going to move my screen here. Where we implement these restoration projects, the when and how we do these types of projects, and then opportunity for questions and answers to follow. So myself and Kate and Amy, all three of us, our offices are located in Mohkinstsis in Calgary. So I'm with the Elbow River Watershed Partnership, Kate's with Leaf Ninjas, and Amy's with Cows and Fish. So Calgary is in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the I'arhei Nakota, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, which I recently learned is now referred to as Calgary Elbow Métis District within the Battle River Territory. Presently, I'm personally at home, which is in Rocky View Métis District, Battle River Territory. Through the land acknowledgement, we're aiming to act on reconciliation. We're recognizing the original stewards of the land for time immemorial. The Indigenous people to this land are the original stewards. Their lives for physical, mental, and holistic well-being relied on being in sync and on being directly connected to the land, water, and all of its kin. Today, we'll be talking about biological restoration. This work is an opportunity for reciprocity, to give back to the land that we as settlers have taken so much from. Everyone, young and old, new stewards or old, can participate in this action of giving back. We hope you enjoy these presentations and are inspired to perform reconciliation through biological restoration. Kate and Amy, did you want to give a little wave before we dive in?
Hi everyone, I'm Kate with Leaf Ninjas.
And I'm Amy with Riparian Management Society, or otherwise known as Cows and Fish.
And I guess I didn't do my introduction. I can't remember. I'm Flora with the Elbow River Watershed Partnership. Thanks to these other orgs for helping support the promotion of the webinar. In addition to our orgs, Bragg Creek Trails and Bow River Basin Council helped promote the webinar. And there may be others, so if I missed anybody, be sure to let me know.
Okay. Well, Flora's gonna, before you go, Flora, I'm gonna read your bio since you're kicking off this webinar with your first presentation. So Flora is the Executive Director for the Elbow River Watershed Partnership, also known as the ERWP. In October, Flora celebrated a 10-year milestone working with the ERWP. With a science and art background and collaborative persona, Flora aims to share hydraulic knowledge with a broad audience, with a key goal in protecting the Elbow's watershed's fresh water. When not engaging in work, Flora enjoys cross-country skiing, mountain biking, hiking with her family and friends, painting, and gardening. All these passions carry her engagement and creativity into the water world and instill an understanding of stewardship. And with that, Flora, you can take it away.
Great, thanks, Kate. So as mentioned, I work for the Elbow River Watershed Partnership based out of Mohkinstsis, and our mission is a healthy Elbow River watershed. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a, from a lens, a fish lens, a story of a fish, and then bringing it in. So I'm going to talk about bull trout a little bit, and full disclosure, I'm not a biologist. I've learned these things about bull trout through other work and a little bit of research. So apologies for anyone that knows a lot more about bull trout than me. So bull trout are native to Western North America, the only native char to historically occupy all drainages of Alberta's eastern slopes. They can be quite large, relatively large. They are late matures, so it's approximately not until the age of 5 before bull trout spawn, which means that they require a whole range of different types of habitat in order to thrive. They emerged from the glacial refugia to our areas after the last ice age, and they are threatened under both provincial and federal legislation. So I want to build a little bit of a picture on what a bull trout, for example, needs to survive. We're starting out with F, the letter F. So bull trout need food, including other fish, such as mountain whitefish, in order to survive and thrive, especially as adults. Bull trout have in-stream needs. They need water, obviously, and in the right quantity and quality. And the 7 C's, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So another food source for bull trout, especially when they're younger, is the benthic invertebrates, those insects that live at the bottoms of the streams. Building up on that, so we're now in S. So why would I put seeds and plants in one of the needs that bullfish have? Because they don't eat plants, but they do rely on seeds and plants indirectly. So for example, the invertebrates, they rely on plants and vegetation to survive. And another example is the healthy riparian areas also help bull trout survival. And one of the last parts of building up what a fish needs is Homo sapiens, or humans. Fish need us in order to survive and thrive. That brings me into the 7 C's. So we know that fish need calories. They need clean, clear, and cold water, especially bull trout. They're used to glacial cold waters, cobbles. So they need a certain size of stones in order to build their nests, which are called redds. And I don't know if this is true, but I heard that redds means cleaning in Gaelic, I think. And so the act of using their fins to clean the cobbles in order to lay their eggs, that's where that name comes from. They also need connected and complex habitat. So connected, especially considering the life cycle of a bull trout, for example, they live in a range of different types of streams. So they might spend a good chunk of their lives in a lake or in a large river. And then when they're spawning or in the winter, they might go upstream into these very small creeks. Sometimes they're extremely small. So for this native fish success and the 7 C's, people need the same things, one could argue, and people are the key to native fish and other species success. What kind of things do we know about bull trout? We know they were abundant. So this photo is a family photo from my family on my dad's side. My grandpa is in that photo, and one of his brothers and their dad, and they're fishing in the Elbow. And as the story goes, when they were catching bull trout were considered a not very pleasant fish. They weren't respected and valued. They were considered competitors with other fish, sport fish, and sometimes they were wasted. If they were caught, they might be left on the shore, on the side of the creek to die. So we know they were abundant, and for multiple reasons, they're not abundant anymore, through habitat degradation, passage barriers, including hand-built rock dams. Sometimes folks build these in the creeks to cool off in the summer. Competition and hybridization for some of the native fish with non-native species. It wasn't until 1995 where bull trout were selected to symbolize the growing concern over threatened wildlife. So not only in Alberta, but around the world, adopted as the official fish of Alberta in 1995. Bull trout is one of 8 species of trout found in the province's glacial waters. Some other things we know about bull trout, they're considered an indicator species. So when it comes to the health of Alberta's headwaters, native trout are the canaries in the coal mine. Adopted to cold, clean, complex, and connected waterways of the eastern slopes of Alberta, they can only thrive when these waterways are well cared for. And that might mean having sediment and silt-free substrates and invertebrate food sources. So, for example, there's natural flows and pulses. We might get a natural influx of sediment in the spring because of the natural processes. But let's say there's a stream crossing and we get a rainstorm in the fall, and that stream crossing might funnel some of the sediment. So, and that's, as we know now, the bull trout are fall spawners. At least I think I mentioned that. So if they're getting some sediment in the fall, that could have detrimental effects on their survival. So they're vulnerable to heavy land use and development that creates changes in surface and groundwater quality and flow, stream fragmentation, and loss of riparian cover. They're also vulnerable to overharvesting and competition from introduced fish species. So they're currently in a catch and release, which is great, but a lot of anglers don't recognize bull trout necessarily. And so sometimes it might take a while for them to get returned. So it's a good rule to have in place, but it's not always works. Bull trout have never been stocked, so variations in population are an excellent indicator. And as mentioned, they're listed as threatened under the Alberta Wildlife Act. So now we've talked a lot about from a river and a creek lens and what a bull trout needs in order to survive and thrive. This term we use in our freshwater field study program that's targeted to grade 8s and 9s. And they go along the Elbow River and the Bow River. And one of our messages that we try and convey is the river is a reflection of the landscape. So what happens on the land affects the water. Coming back to restoration and reciprocity, and knowing that bull trout are adapted to cold, clean, complex, and connected waterways, restoration provides opportunity to help keep these waterways healthy. Riparian areas also help keep waterways sediment and silt free and provide invertebrate food sources. We know that bull trout are vulnerable to heavy land use. So by making this connection between land and water and that human factor, we can all make a difference. We can all be a land steward. And when you are a land steward, you are also a water steward. Anyone can participate in restoration. as mentioned, so as we keep in mind that the river is a reflection of the landscape, by improving the land, we improve habitat, water quality, and water quantity. We can improve habitat and give back to the landscape through restoration. So some of the whys of biological restoration are cleaner water. This is important for people and all of our native kin. It helps with biodiversity. It helps with climate adaptability. Some of you may have heard of the term nature-based solutions. This is a nature-based solution to help us be more adaptable in the area to climate. The landscape is vulnerable to these extreme weather events that we have been and will be seeing. So biological restoration can help with this. It helps with carbon storage. And specifically talking about riparian areas, I recently learned I saw a presentation by Herb Hammond, retired forester, and I didn't know this, but riparian areas also help regulate flows from the upslope forests. That they work as a filter. So restoration and reciprocity, it's good for the whole person, for the mental, physical well-being, and we are all connected. And I know Amy's going to talk a bit more about that soon. Just wanted to take this moment to express gratitude for what we do have, and hope. And I know one of my goals through this presentation is to inspire hope and motivation. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will introduce Amy. Just gonna pull up her bio. So Amy is the Provincial Riparian Specialist for the Riparian Management Society, also known as Cows and Fish presently. Amy has a Master of Science in Environmental Practice, a bachelor's degree in biology, and is registered professional biologist. Amy's master's work focused on the application of sustainable solutions for socio-ecological resilience, specifically on the utilization of green infrastructure and community engagement to reconnect people to natural systems and solutions. Prior to working with Cows and Fish, Amy was with Alberta government, where she worked in the environmental monitoring program, focusing on water quality and quantity. The surface water modeling program supporting water allocation and water quality modeling in southern Alberta as an environmental protection officer focused on water treatment. Amy has spent over 15 years working on watersheds across Alberta. When not working, she is usually playing outside in the woods and in or by the water with her daughters, Willow and Rowan, and her dog Cedar, or making art. Sounds like we've got a creative bunch. Thanks. So Amy, are you ready?
Yeah, I just want to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes, confirmed.
Yes, and obviously you can hear me by way of your answer. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Flora, for the introduction. As previously mentioned, my name is Amy, and I am with Cows and Fish. And typically, when I start talks about restoration, I like to use these three images presented here, and they're of three very different living organisms. But interestingly enough, these organisms are quite related, and the images look similar. So if anyone cares to wager a guess on what they might be, please feel free to pop that into the chat box. And I guess the reason I'm showing them is it's the basis for what I'm going to talk about in the what is restoration portion of this presentation. And so I'll just give a couple of minutes for those of you that are interested to ponder and perhaps share some of the answers that you might have to this question. Excellent. Yeah. Some very good ideas. So from left to right, or at least on my screen, it's a human fingerprint. The center image is a magnification of a salmonid scale, which Flora mentioned bull trout, and bull trout belong to the salmonid family. And then on the right side is a tree ring. And as Flora also mentioned in her talk, trees, fish, and humans, or more broadly, if we think about it, land, water, and people, are all connected and they impact one another. So in talking about what restoration is today, I will focus on the importance of the connection and the reconnection between these three things. And so just like the human body, when parts of the system lose functional capacity, the ability to perform life-enhancing processes breaks down. For example, if the arteries are restricted within your body and within the circulatory system, we have a decreased ability to receive fluids and nutrients to the rest of the body. So the rest of our system has to work harder for that to happen. And this is also true at the scale of a river system. So where restricted channels cannot deliver water and nutrients to and from the floodplain. Riparian areas, and Flora mentioned that word riparian before, are those areas that connect land and water. And these spaces are critical for river processes, such as water balance and nutrient exchange. Riparian areas are essentially the kidneys of the watershed because they filter and control the hydraulic pressure of the system. So when functioning optimally in the system, they help filter water, they hold stream banks together, they allow water infiltration into the soil so that recharges groundwater. They provide shading for a stream and food and shelter for all kinds of creatures who then also contribute to many functions within the system, such as nutrient cycling and so on. And like the human body, when we refer to as a riparian area as healthy, we are meaning that the riparian area is performing all of those critical functions needing to sustain the system. And when I use the term restoration, I mean returning function to a process or the relationship between processes within a larger system. And sometimes all you really need to do is look across a fence line. And in these two images, you'll notice that one side of that fence is obviously performing some of those ecological functions a lot better than the other side. And so one side we would call healthy and the other not. And so at the scale of a riparian area, it's the interaction of water, soil, and vegetation that are critical for understanding function, and therefore health. The living and physical components interact to create optimal structure and function in the system. And as riparian specialists with cows and fish, we use plants as a proxy or as an indicator of physical health, much in the same way we can use fish, such as bull trout, as an indicator of aquatic health. Now, if we take a step back at the watershed scale, when trying to understand function and relationship, it's the interaction of geology or physical characteristics that creates form. Hydrology, how water and therefore material is moved through the system, and biology, how the living components interact with the non-living community that will create this entire system. So it gets quite complicated, especially when you add people and culture to the mix. But it's incredibly impressive how multiple species and multiple pieces of the environment work together to create an intricate and efficient web of collaboration. So when we reduce our rivers to a thin blue line on a map, we reduce our ability to understand our river system as a complete system. So to restore function, we need to step back from the water's edge and look at the entire floodplain or riparian area and the rest of the watershed. And that includes us as well, people. So the term riverscape from Utah State Restoration Consortium refers to a connected floodplain and channel habitats that together make up an entire valley bottom. And so this system includes interconnected riparian, groundwater and channel habitats, and their associated living communities that are sustained by all the physical and biological processes taking place in that space. So the entire space, what we refer to as process space, is important to allow for all of the essential functions. The goal of our restoration then would be to improve the health of as much of that space as possible, ensuring that we are setting the right trajectory for healing so that the systems can be self-sustaining. And this image is an example of a channel that is disconnected from its floodplain. So land management decisions over time have led to increased soil compaction and vegetation removal. And this down cutting, or technically what we call incisement in a system, is a form of vertical erosion. It means that the water in that channel, much like in the artery system of the human body, is going to have a lot of trouble getting to the rest of the system, up and out onto the floodplain. And this is important for it to do so to dissipate energy out of the system and prevent further erosion, and also to rehydrate the soils and provide forage for animals living in the space. So what can be done to restore the function of these degraded spaces? Just like when our bodies start to lose function, we need to look at our lifestyle. So to reduce the pressure in a system and to provide that process space, we need to expand, again, what we consider our restoration area. So I would argue it's that entire floodplain system. So when we build too close to the river, or we harden and straighten channels, we create what's called fluvial squeeze. And like a restricted artery, we're actually increasing the pressure in the system, which increases the erosion. And the more we squeeze and the more stress we put on the system, just like a human body, the less resilient and self-sustaining the system becomes. So what can we do? Just like people, nature works best when you let it rest. Changes might be as simple as putting up a fence and letting nature do the rest. This is an image of Dog Pound Creek, which is northwest of Calgary in the Red Deer River Watershed. And as a result of moving a fence line farther back out of the riparian area and providing watering trough for cattle, we see healing occurring through plant regrowth. But you will note from 2004 to 2020, that's 16 years that took for those plants to regrow on their own. Sometimes it's a change in behavior. Research also suggests that cattle do better in terms of weight gain on clean water, especially if they don't have to work as hard for it. They will also avoid contaminated water if they're offered clean water. So some of the restoration work we do at Cows and Fish is more about working with land managers and investing in encouraging practices such as controlled timing and access to surface water for livestock. No need to mow, let it grow. This is an expanded or unmowed buffer on a golf course in Calgary. Again, by not mowing, saving ourselves time and money in that effort, we get regrowth and increased protection. But as mentioned, healing does take time naturally. Natural succession in vegetation communities can take over 100 years. So what are some of the ways we can start to kickstart this healing or speed it up in spaces of critical habitat where declining fish populations are depending on us? Well, like diet and exercise, we can enhance and speed up healing in our bodies using natural interventions. And just like we can on the natural landscape, we can use these natural interventions to bring back structure and function. So leave it to beaver. Beaver are nature's ecosystem engineers and pivotal in creating healthy, complex stream systems and wetland complexes. Beaver dams and their associated ponds really help slow the flow of water and increase infiltration of water through the soil. So that really helps with groundwater storage. And as the water slows, sediment settles out of the water, which can settle to the bottom and help lift that stream bed over time and reconnect channels to floodplains. This also allows extra hydration. So in turn, you're having more water availability for plants to regrow. And among the many benefits that I listed, I want to take a moment here to talk about water storage, which is critical in times of drought, such as what we're facing here in southern Alberta. So the ponds that beavers create store a whole lot of water on the landscape. And this water storage means that there's also more groundwater available. And in some cases, 5 to 10 times more water is available below that beaver pond than on the surface. And again, this is a huge benefit and critically important for things like wildfire that seem to be increasing. And there's emerging evidence that beaver ponds contribute to less intense and extensive wildfires. And this is some work by Dr. Emily Fairfax, a researcher out of the US, who's been contributing a lot of knowledge on this issue. So restoring our relationship to beaver and allowing them to remain on the landscape is critical for providing that extra structure and function to promote watershed health and restoration. And if you want more information on working with beaver, you can visit the website listed here, and maybe Logan, you can pop that into the chat box for folks. This is a collaborative effort between Cows and Fish and the Misaki Institute. And when we lack beaver in some cases, in areas where perhaps we've lost the woody vegetation, like that image I showed, and the water depth can't sustain beaver, we can mimic some of the processes that beaver initiate. So low-tech process-based restoration is a concept, again, from Utah State, aimed at restoring process in structurally starved riverscapes through addition of in-stream woody debris. And this is just an example of one of the techniques. It's called a beaver dam analog, or what we call a BDA, and they're essentially human-engineered beaver dams. And so if you recall that image I showed earlier of that vertically eroded channel, this technique can really help slow flow down, dissipate energy, allow the water to come up and over onto the floodplain, and over time, as sediment drops out, start to lift the stream bottom back up so the channel is no longer incised. Soil bioengineering, which is the roots of the solution, and I'm not going to go into detail on this because Kate will be discussing this in her upcoming presentation, but I do want to note that it is the use of living material, so again, that natural solution to perform structural or engineering purposes, and you have the co-benefit of extra vegetation and habitat on the landscape. So adding planted material, whether it's and woody debris and plant litter even to a space, can add that structural complexity and diversity that's needed. And even that woody debris on top of the land surface will help slow overland flow. It can restrict human traffic, which is a behavioral change, but it also provides spaces for animals to hide and for animals to have some cover while they go to the bathroom, in turn spreading seeds. And so there are many benefits of adding fiber to your diet and to the diet of your riparian system, such as reducing surface runoff, increased soil moisture, decreased erosion, again, that habitat value for food and shelter, maintaining nutrient cycles, so you can have leaves from the trees on the shoreline falling into the water and cycling through nutrients, air purification once the vegetation takes hold, recreational opportunities in these beautiful spaces, and increased nature connection and well-being. And there's many studies on nature connection demonstrating that when we spend time out in nature, we can reduce our blood pressure and stress levels. And so I want to finish lastly with mental health as an intervention. Just like in our lives, sometimes we need to address what we're carrying around in our heads to impact the health of the system. So in order to protect the nature that's all around us, we must think long and hard about the nature that we're carrying in our head. Sometimes education, understanding, and changing expectations is restoration in and of itself. So again, when I use that term restoration, what I'm really talking about, and Flora mentioned this before, is connection, and in some cases, reconnection, the healing of broken relationships. So we can reconnect channels to floodplains in restoration, we can reconnect streams to the rest of the watershed, but we can also reconnect communities to the landscapes that support them. So if we broaden our definition of restoration, we could include, among many things, advocacy, giving your voice, education, giving your attention, sweat equity, giving your labor, so you can sign up for any sort of volunteer restoration event, and I think Logan will be providing some opportunities in the chat box. And civic responsibility, giving your vote. So I'm sure if we're creative enough, and like Flora mentioned, I like to make art, we can find a place where we can cultivate change and progress restoration. And that is all I have for you. I believe Kate is up next.
Excellent, Amy. Thanks for sharing all of that.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Amy. I'll introduce Kate. I'll read her bio. So Kate is a senior project manager at Leaf Ninjas, Inc., where she uses her background in wildlife biology, insect ecology, and plant communities towards restoring native habitats. Kate has worked on restoration projects in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, and industrial reclamation initiatives in British Columbia. Her work includes revegetating disturbed riparian areas, creating wetland habitats, reforesting unproductive land, managing invasive species, and leading science education and community engagement events. Additionally, Kate develops techniques to innovate restoration practices and leads monitoring programs to track restoration progress and efficiency. Kate is committed to further developing sustainable restoration practices and engaging communities in habitat conservation. Thank you, Kate. So it looks like you got your slides ready. I'll sign off.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Flora. So as Flora mentioned, I'm a senior project with Leaf Ninjas. We are an ecological restoration company that works throughout Alberta and into BC and the surrounding provinces. So I'm going to be talking about kind of the where and when of ecological restoration. So of course, the best time to start restoration is now. The sooner you can address a problem, the better that area is going to be able to kind of bounce back from that disturbance. When an area is just first disturbed, there are still many of the soil biota and natural processes in the area. But as time progresses, those start to lose. Different plant communities start moving in, and it becomes more challenging to address the issues and reconnect that system. And where can restoration begin? It can begin anywhere. I'm going to be focusing a lot on techniques and applications used along riverways in riparian areas. But restoration can start even in your own backyard, switching to things like native grasses for your lawns and native plants in your planting bed. Touching upon the species to use, it's always great, even in your backyards, but especially for restoration projects, to use species that are native to the area. Those native plants have adapted to the communities that they're in. They have relationships with the soil biome. They have relationships with the plants, other plants and animals in the area. And they're really going to thrive in those restoration projects. I love the saying that there's no wrong plants, only wrong places. So now that you're going to choose a native species, there are a couple different formats that plants come in that can affect your restoration project. Some of these formats will do better in certain areas compared to other, which we'll touch on in just a bit. So you have your container plants. These are a plant in a pot, probably very noticeable. You've seen these in your day-to-day life. They have an established root system, and that allows them to better compete when they're placed in areas that have established vegetation. However, if you're using them in a large-scale restoration project, there can be a delay to make sure that you're acquiring the specific species or genetics needed. Live stakes. So this is a branch cutting from usually a willow or a balsam poplar or a cottonwood. This is very common used in restoration practices because they can be quick to install and quick to harvest and fairly cost effective. However, you are requiring that plant to establish where it's planted. So there are some specific conditions that you have to have available, such as low competition from other plants, available soil rooting medium, and soil nutrients. And then there's rooting stakes. So just like a live stake, this would be a branch cutting from a species that's able to root, such as a willow or a poplar. But instead of planting it in the location, you're going to plant it in a container and allow that plant to develop its root system before being used in your restoration project. So this just allows your plant that you're planting to have an established root system. It helps them again when there's more competition or in drier conditions. However, again, it does take more kind of a time commitment before you're able to use that plant material. So container plants, as I mentioned, they're ideal in areas like these grassy banks where, because either through human use or mowing, the plant community has kind of been established. It can be kind of like a smooth brome area or just some kind of exotic plant community that's moved in. Container plants with their established root systems can better compete in these areas compared to something like an unrooted stake. If you have a selection of pots that you can choose from, choosing something that's more in the forestry style, that's a pot that's deeper compared to wider, can give your plants an advantage, especially if they're going to be placed in areas that won't necessarily be receiving irrigation, just because that deeper root system can help them withstand desiccation. And then one thing to always look for when you are planting a container plant is root spiraling. You can select pots such as this top right picture here, air pruning pots, or pots that prevent spiraling. Or if you're just using a regular pot, just take a look at the root system of a plant before you plant it. This bottom picture is of about a 9-foot aspen that was planted with spiral roots. And you can see that those roots never left the footprint of the container that it was housed in. Live stakes are by far the most versatile in restoration. They can be planted in areas where it's hard to get machinery in, or like this crib wall where they're being installed from a boat. Live stakes do well in areas where there's low competition with other vegetation, where there's available medium for their roots to root in, as well as available soil nutrients. That being said, they don't do well when there's heavy shade or competition with a lot of tall grasses. And they need some special care during establishment because they can be sensitive to drought and heat conditions. So providing irrigation when they are first establishing those roots can be a way to give them a head start. And then these are just some rooted stakes. You can see they come in different formats. The upper left picture here is of more of like a forestry container style plant that could be used as you would a container plant, dig a hole and put the plant, or they can be a taller rooted stake. These are great in use for brush layers or when you need a taller plant. So we use these stakes and these plants in our restoration programs because their roots are able to hold onto soil and prevent erosion. Looking at the development of roots on some willow stakes, you can see the first two pictures on the left. This is the first year stake. Roots start to develop from the top of the soil to about 30 centimeters in depth. And then after their second year, the 3 photos on the right, they start to send out lateral roots. And eventually in a species that's bred clonally, you will see new plants developing around year 5 after a plant is planted. In Alberta, especially in some of the drier areas, once a stake is installed, usually you do that by driving in a pilot hole. You place your cut branch into that hole. You make sure that it is backfilled and that there's good connection between the soil and the stake. There's no air in there. And then typically we would be cutting back these stakes to about 5 centimeters above the ground with about 3 visible bud scars. This is specifically done to help with stakes drying out over the winter and the summer. Most typically when you plant a stake, you're going to see that it starts to die back to the ground anyways. And by trimming them back, you're kind of promoting the new growth that's going to start right at the base of this, where the stake meets the soil. However, sometimes tall vegetation could be needed. This might be needed to overhang a river or to prevent people from kind of walking in a trail that's being closed. In that case, using a pre-rooted stake is ideal because that established root system is going to make the plant a little bit more hardy and help in their survival as they're being established. Stake length, there is a trade-off between the ease of planting, the ease of finding it, but also the survival rate with stake length. So as the length of the stake you plant gets longer, there is an increase in survival rate and the viability, so the amount of growth during your first year. However, planting a longer stake takes a longer time. You have to drive a pilot hole that's deeper. You have to be able to find these long, straight stakes. So depending on your project site, there is a trade-off between what length of stake you plant. It also might come down to your area deciding what length of stake you can plant. Because if you have an area with only a half a meter of loose kind of substrate, you're not going to be able to drive a pilot hole greater than that length. This is just a quick example of a study that was done here at Leaf Ninjas. We were just looking at 3 different lengths of stake. You have our tallest stakes were 120 centimeters, all the way down to 20 centimeter stakes. 50 of each were planted along a bank, and then they're planted in May, and then in August, it just came back. I measured the survival rate as well as the length of the new growth. And you can see that the longer stakes, the 120 centimeter stakes, had a survival rate of 94% and average length of new growth of 63 centimeters. And comparing that to the smallest stakes, the 20 centimeter ones, they only had a 50% survival rate and an average length of new growth of 27 centimeters. So there was quite a difference depending on the length of the stake that was planted. At this site, you were able to plant a 120 centimeter stake. However, if you are working on a site that's much more rocky, you can take in mind that you might want to overplant if you can only plant a 20 to 50 centimeter stake, as well as include some soil additives to kind of help increase the growth during the first year. So now that I've talked about container plants and stakes, I'm going to mention a couple other planting strategies using stakes, such as brush layers. So this is where, as you are building a bank, you are creating a layer of willows, usually willow stakes, but it could also be a rooting stake such as a poplar. Bush layers are great if you have large machinery and if you can install them while the bank or the riprap is being placed. So it requires a little bit of cooperation between your planting and your machine operators, but it is a way to get great rooting medium and plants directly where you need them. Machines, on the other hand, these are easier to install in that they don't require too much heavy machinery. And these are great if you are addressing a bank that has a very steep slope that you need to cut back. In terrace, to slow the spread, to slow the flow of water across it, these are using bundles of unrooted stakes, and you trench them into the ground. You can do this along an existing runoff or, again, back into a bank. They can be made using alive or dead stakes, depending on your site's need. If it's going to be a very dry area at the top, you might not want to waste any live stakes there and concentrate them more on a moisture lower section. And they can be incorporated along with live stakes and container plants. One thing to note is that when you're installing your bundles, if they are live, you want to make sure that you are filling in them and packing them with soil, because you need that good moist soil connection to the stake in order for them to root. And then air layering, it's something that I've just kind of started in the last year, so I'm still figuring out all its applications, but it's great to use when you have a nice healthy layer of vegetative growth beside an area that you're trying to restore. So for example, these are pictures of gravel bars and brush layers where the vegetation is doing great in one area, but right beside it, it is bare. So for air layering, you leave the stake attached to the plant that it's growing from. You would lay it flat, trim off all of the lateral branches and the top, and then make sure that that bare stake is then in contact with the ground. That can involve piling soil on top of it, weighing it down with rocks or fabric, and just maintaining that contact with the moist soil so that that plant will start sending out new roots and regrowing while still attached to the parent plant. So location can be, there's challenges associated with different locations. So when you are planning a restoration project, kind of taking these to account can help you speed along the restoration process and bring back those connections between the site, the soil, the water, and the biota. So if you're planting along a bank in a riparian area, it's good to take into account if there are any undercuts to that bank, what is the stability of that bank. As stakes, again, you need that good soil contact along the length of the stake. So if there is an undercut area like this top left picture, stakes will perform poorly in these areas. And it can often be hard to find if your bank is undercut if the water level is quite high when you're planting. So being used to your site, having a relationship with the history of that site is a great way to determine where these restoration techniques can be best used. In areas of grassy competition, again, stakes can be avoided. And areas where a lot of loose soil is being actively eroded, because again, you're just going to expose more of your stake and can lead it to poor survival. To address these kinds of areas, you can use something like a sediment log, like in this top right picture. And this sediment log can capture the soil that's fallen above it, creating a nice little bank for you to plant in. Or you can use more of container plants, because those can be planted fully in the bank, as well as further down into the bank along the existing plant communities, and can kind of survive some of that competition. Soil, so I mentioned these sediment logs, like this bottom left picture. Sediment logs are great because they can catch the soil falling from above to create a planting bank. However, you still need to consider the nutrients available in that soil. The two pictures on the bottom, the one on the left, has a sediment log that's just collecting the soil from above, whereas the picture on the right added soil behind those sediment logs. The sediment log was used kind of like a bank, and supplementary soil and nutrients was placed behind it. And you can see these willows are really taking off, and this was just their first year. If you are working in an area that is a little bit more fragile, if you're worried about loose soil getting into the water or running away, you can use a product of a soil bag. So this top right picture here, these are Hendon bags. They are bags, burlap sacks filled with soil that can then be used to build up collapsed areas. You can stake right in these with willow or poplar stakes. You can plant in them with container plants, and it just that burlap holds onto the soil a little bit more and gives time for those roots to develop before the burlap starts to decompose. Riprap areas are always kind of a challenge to revegetate, if at all possible, as this picture in the top right. Try to use brush layers, try to work with the construction team who are building those banks to incorporate vegetation as they're built. That way they're kind of vegetated from the start, and it saves you a little bit of trouble of having to come in afterwards. If you are coming in afterwards, targeting areas around the perimeter of riprap where it's not so deep can work. You can also remove a couple of the rocks by hand, fill in that section with stakes, and then gently plant the rocks back on top. However, you do want to avoid gaps. So this bottom left picture, here's a gap in a riprap bank. And this riprap bank had been there for about 5 years or more, and still air pockets were existing within it. And planting anything near an air pocket will be a big challenge to get it to establish, because you will have those roots drying out. If you are trying to establish an existing riprap, if you can take advantage of any like flood cycles that are depositing sediment along the river. That might be an area where you can first start to establish vegetation and then use that flood cycle and the deposition of material to continue planting. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is establishing native plant material when there already is an established vegetation cover. And many of the projects that I work within, that is usually smooth brome or other invasive species such as creeping bellflower or Canadian thistle. If at all possible, if you can address these before restoration, that is best, either through removing the plants from the site, applying a herbicide if you have to, or doing another treatment such as this middle picture here at the top using steam. However, usually timelines and price usually limits what you can attack and the length of time you can address the project before planting. In that case, try to use something that can limit or suppress competition, such as mulch, material squares, or material rolls, just to give your plants an extra advantage with that competition. And you can also use plants or plugs that have a root system that can help with the competition. There's also cluster planting. So that's installing many small plants of the same species tightly packed together. And that way, as you can see at the bottom with this water smart weed, as it grows, that community is able to form and kind of hold its own against kind of the surrounding weeds they're trying to move in. So I know that was a whirlwind. So just to review some of the key points, start restoration right away. Choose native species for your projects. Consider the community, the soil, the plants, and then work with nature, not against it. And I know all of that was for very specific examples along riparian areas, but even in your own backyard or your own community, you can plant native species. You can leave the leaves if your fire regime in your area allows it. You can leave stems stubble for native bees. So that's when you cut back your perennial plants. Don't cut them back right to the ground. Leave some of that complexity and some shelter for your pollinators. And you can get involved with your community and let people know that restoration matters for you. I'll just leave you with this quote, one of my favorites: to plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow. And if you're interested in any of the work that Leaf Ninjas is doing, our website is on this page and you can follow our Instagram.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was super interesting, as well as Amy's. We're on perfect time. We've got 15 minutes for Q&A. One thing I forgot to do at the beginning was we're curious about where folks are calling in from. So if you get a chance before the end of the presentation, send in the chat where you're located. That would be helpful. So in terms of questions, folks can ask questions in the Q&A.
I see there's a question from Dave, not in the Q&A box, but in the chat, asking how you determine if a point bar is good to stabilize or not. I'm thinking about the gravel bar by the trading post, Flora.
Okay, specifics. So a point bar, I'm thinking of that one. So I guess the one challenge working on that point bar is that would be, I think, in the below the high water mark. So certainly work could be done there, but there would be some added permitting required. Did you want to talk a bit about that, Amy? What would be required?
Well, if you're working below the high water mark, then yeah, you would, or what we call in like the active channel, you would require a Water Act permit at this point for to go ahead and plant anything in it. Also, with even on bed and shore, technically you're in public land, so you may require a temporary field authorization as well. But I don't know, and maybe you could add in the chat, are you specifically meaning whether or not it's a good idea, whether or not they tend to be successful, those types of plantings?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. I'm not familiar with the specific area or what permits you would need for that area. But if you're trying to decide if plants that you planted there would survive or not, you can kind of look at the plant community that is existing there. Are grasses starting to grow? Do you see any evidence of during the spring, are willow seeds or poplar seeds able to stick to that site and start to establish? So if you look at what the plant community is doing there, it gives you an idea of what might be lacking in order to have larger plants survive there.
Yeah, and you just added a comment about it was an area that was just constructed for the berm. So yeah, if it's on the inside of the berm, and interestingly enough, using hardened surfaces, like I mentioned on that fluvial squeeze idea, and berming actually causes incisement. In this case, you're trying to do it because you're not wanting floodwaters to come in for probably a reason that infrastructure was built too close to the channel. So there's a trade-off there. There's a reason people use berming. However, yeah, you've essentially done that. You've restricted the ability for your channel to communicate to the floodplain. So you've cut it off entirely. And so one of the things when I showed that vertically incised ditching channel, the only other way a stream channel can basically move is down. And then once it goes down to a certain point, the healing process actually occurs by revegetating those point bars, right? So you end up building a tiny little floodplain inside of that bermed up area, which, I mean, isn't as probably beneficial of having an entire floodplain, but it is part of the healing process. So I think in that case, then yeah, adding some vegetation there would be a way to reestablish a new lower terrace or floodplain.
I see Dave's acknowledged your response. He says, yes, I was thinking of assisting invertebrate growth. Exactly, Amy. We would have to contact DFO, I think. This is great because this was going to be one of our questions to the group is, I don't know, Logan, if you're ready to send out the survey, asking folks if they have an area in mind that they think could be restored. Oh, there we go. That survey should have popped up for folks. So if you don't mind filling it out, that can help us with our conversation too.
Oh, I see, Flora, there's some questions that have popped into the Q&A box as well. So 3 from Colin. First one being, how can concerned citizens advocate for increased restoration funding across Alberta? And I don't know, Flora, did you want to tackle that one? Or?
Sure. One thing that is underway is some groups submitted a letter that was, I think that was started by the Old Man Watershed, and that was directed towards, there's a program called Watershed Resilience and Restoration program. It's a Government of Alberta program, and that's specifically applicable to restoration, especially in priority watersheds. So our East Slopes watersheds are all priority. Some of them have higher levels of priority. I know specifically because I focus on the Elbow watershed is considered a high priority restoration site, being upstream of 500,000 people. Well, more than 500,000, but approximately 500,000 folks drink from the Glenmore Reservoir. Did you have something to add to that, Amy?
Yeah, I would say, I guess too, in using, I mean, your voice in the political sense for increased government funding, is some of the complications surrounding this work are typically involved with things like permitting processes that maybe aren't aren't so clear, or a little bit too onerous for some of these smaller groups or volunteer organizations and community organizations that want to undertake a project. Most of the budget ends up being eaten up by, getting through a process. So one of the things I think that you could do, and I know in the past a letter had been penned to MLAs to look into having codes of practices developed for restoration techniques, such as things like live staking. They're relatively low, and particularly in low risk settings, right? So that some of those processes aren't as onerous. And again, just recognizing that the more times people are applying into these grants or funding opportunities, we start to see that there is actually a desire for more of this work to happen. And so sometimes you can see some funding get increased to certain areas. That's really all I have. Kate, do you have anything to add?
No, I think mostly you covered it. Just try to bring awareness about Native species in your city, in your community groups. If there is a community garden, advocate for native plants.
Yeah, and I see another question from Colin about increasing involvement from the public in restoration thinking. And when Flora did my introduction, she mentioned that my master's work was done on sort of community-based green infrastructure projects. And in that sort of research, what was really clear in a lot of the restoration that was being done is if the community wasn't engaged in the plan or in why it was being done beforehand, often there was a bit of a disconnect, and sometimes even people didn't like it, or they would go about, maybe it was a buffer strip that was being left, and they would think, oh, the city's just being lazy, so they'd go ahead and mow it. So I think communication is super critical in letting people know what these things are for, because often it is new. And I think a lot of us have grown up in a fairly manicured environment. So when we see things being naturalized, it's, sort of in opposition to our belief system. So again, that's that check your head. And I think education, like workshops like this, so that people can actually get involved. And, if you get people out doing the work and planting the trees, they're going to take care of those trees because they're a little bit more invested in the outcome at that point. Kate, Flora, anything to add there?
Yeah, just to re-highlight what you said about restoration and those natural processes. They're messy, and so if folks are accustomed to seeing something that's really smooth and green and not messy, sometimes they don't realize how it's performing a function. And so yeah, sometimes what we just have to put up temporary fences, especially in really public areas. It's just the best way to help mitigate the plants while they're getting established.
If you have an area on your lawn or property or community that you're able to kind of set up a demonstration of what a restoration area looks like and have an informative sign, that can be a great way to kind of bring restoration into more of the urban environment.
Right, yeah. Someone asked about any comments on the most effective plantings to keep pets, dogs specifically, from using the riparian zone as their watering hole. I don't have direct experience, but I would think like wild rose or things that are prickly, maybe.
Yeah, anything. Plant a lot of gooseberry and a lot of the native roses. Also, again, willow staking can be effective if it's planted kind of densely. The pets don't like to walk so much on those pokey sticks.
Yeah, and I see another question in the Q&A from Colin regarding in the fall, the city of Calgary euthanized 2 beavers, probably many more over the years. Is there a potential for a relocation program to move beaver from urban areas to headwaters or private landowners looking for beaver? And that's definitely something that has, there's been a bit of an increased demand for, or at least that I've seen in the Working with Beaver Collaborative to, as I said, there's some watersheds where it's certainly appropriate to have many more beaver, and they're not there typically because sometimes it's lack of food or resources, but sometimes it's predation. And so there is opportunity to relocate beaver. However, there's all kinds of considerations that need to come into play for that to happen. And a lot of it has to do with the humaneness of moving a beaver out of its habitat and into new habitat where it's potentially could either be transmitting disease, or it could be also encroaching on another animal's habitat. Beavers are very territorial with their habitat. But outside of that, like I think, those are things that can be managed. There's testing that can be done to ensure disease transmission isn't happening. I think it's just the mechanism to do this isn't really in place. Like, it's kind of like when you go about on your own trying to undertake a restoration project. There's a lot of permitting and unknowns that go into it, and a lot of planning, and then that can be restrictive in itself. So again, absolutely, I think this is something that if we had appropriate legislation and easy ways or codes of practices to go about doing some of these activities, restoration would be a lot more easy. And I will say, in the Working with Beaver Collaborative, we've recently put out a beneficial management practices guide for beaver. Relocation isn't specifically addressed in it, but that will be open for review, and we will have some presentations coming up. So if you pop onto our website and get on our list, you'll stay updated when those presentations start to happen. Kate, Flora, any comments on beaver?
Yeah, I don't know about the scenario in the city of Calgary specifically, but they're just mentioning there's also beaver coexistence opportunities, and they're becoming more and more known and available. And so I guess we have a demo beaver coexistence site in West Bragg Creek day use area. We installed a pond leveler. So there are other examples. Again, I know the city of Calgary has their own beaver management program, and obviously the space is more limited in Calgary than, say, the headwaters. So those coexistence measures can be more challenging, but just to highlight that there are other ways to coexist with beavers that might not necessarily mean relocation.
Yeah, absolutely. Do they belong everywhere? No. There's certain places such as, around septic ponds and things like that where having beaver obviously isn't appropriate. And then much like, with rivers, right? Certain instances where there's infrastructure risks, bridges, roads, things like that being flooded out. But if you check out the Working with Beaver website that I had mentioned in my presentation, there's a map you can check out of all kinds of coexistence tools that have been utilized throughout the province, and we have done a few of them right here in the city of Calgary. And the city of Calgary did have a fairly robust coexistence plan. You might notice in some of the parks that you go to, there's been tree wrapping done so that beaver can stay, but so can some of the trees that the public were missing. And so I do think, while more could be done on this, I would stay tuned, because I am noticing that there is, I guess, a larger appetite for having more beaver on the landscape. Again, especially considering that we're coming into drought years.
I just want to mention there's a question up here in the chat that's getting buried by Zane. Great question, Zane. Battle River by Irma and Wainwright can be quite murky and is very low now. Also, there's lots of agricultural around that river. Just wondering if that is an indicator that restoration needs to be done.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I guess I could start just by way of if there's bare ground or compacted ground in the area, then that is likely an area that could be restored, but and I think I can't remember, Kate or Amy highlighted restoration can also look like exclusion fencing, and there's other ways to work, or off-stream water. But that's all I have to say. I imagine, Amy, you have some more.
Yeah, I mean, some systems are naturally murky. I guess it just depends, and that's why I talked about the interface between geology, hydrology, and biology, right? Is that in some situations, depending on ground composition, I'm from Drumheller originally, so critically aware of this, or if you live in the Milk River region, those systems tend to be murky because there's natural high rates of erosion just because of the type of land formation. And soils. So murky doesn't necessarily mean a problem, but if it's a change in time, or it's not murky a little bit upstream or downstream, but just in one location, probably an indication that there's something contributing sediment into the system. So again, like Flora mentioned, and that could be, multiple things from, livestock accessing a system to, maybe there was a flood recently and so there was a large influx of eroded material into the stream. So I guess, like anything in ecology, the answer is it depends. But if you live in that community and you've been on the stream for a while and it's a change can usually indicate, that there's potential for intervention.
Yeah, and I've just mentioned things, just look for changes in the plant communities and at those plant borders. Are they bare? Are there healthy trees and native species, or is it agriculture?
Right. And Battle River, is that close to Red Deer?
Yeah, it's in the Red Deer River watershed.
Okay.
It's north of the
So
Blind Man River.
I know, yeah, Cows and Fish, you've done work in that area, right? And Leaf Ninjas, I imagine you would be available to travel those kind of distances if there was an assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. We've worked on the battle before. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you the status of riparian health in that area, but like many of the populated, both populated and rural landscapes that are agricultural focused in Alberta, there typically are some issues. Yes.
I think there's one more question. I don't know. It seems like there's a few folks. There's still 27 folks here, so we could probably answer this last question, and then I did a little draw prize, and so I'm hoping that the person whose name was drawn virtually with the app is still here. So the last question I see, do you see more partners, clients seeking out restoration work for the main purpose of climate adaptation? Calgary and Okotoks have recently made some elaborate plans to incorporate natural infrastructure and restoration as part of their climate resilience plans. Does this ring true in your work as well? I would say
yeah. So the projects that I am seeing more and more of are, they're actually kind of adjacent to climate adaptation. They're results of kind of weather patterns that we've seen. So floods, there's still work being done in Calgary that was caused by the 2013 flood, kind of seeking out to strengthen those banks in areas that can be affected. So most of my work, I see it's not necessarily adapting ahead of for climate change, but responding to the changes in processes that we're already seeing.
How about you, Amy? Are you working with municipalities or seeing that language, that climate adaptability with nature-based solutions in your work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's seeing it come down from funders as well. I think there is, given that have on one hand the issue of climate change, and then on the other hand, species at risk. I think natural solutions bridges both of those areas. right? Where you're providing habitat, but also providing adaptability and resilience. And, I talk about it like it gets complicated between the interactions of living, like the biological and the physical components of an environment. One thing we do know is that increased diversity within a system allows for more resilience and adaptability. So absolutely, when you're looking at natural solutions and working with particularly native plants and things that provide other co-benefits, you're seeing an increase to also habitat and other things as well, right? So for sure, I think many of the municipalities, particularly in these years of flooding and drought too, are interested in those riparian buffers to mitigate land loss. So yeah, I think you can, multi-solve that problem.
Yeah, I'm also seeing kind of a moving away from like hard structures to stop river, and they're trying to incorporate more vegetation into our riparian area or riprap areas, as well as a thought for more of wildlife use and insect and pollinator habitat.
Multiple benefits from one action. I think we'll need to conclude our webinar, but I do have a winner, and I'm hoping the person is still on. So we had a draw prize. I'll try and show it. It's a balm. It's called Balm of Gilead, a sore muscle salve. It's got balsam poplar buds in it, and one of our volunteers during our November planting in West Bragg produces this product. It's called Saint Alchemy, and so the winner is Delilah B. So I'm hoping Delilah is still on, and if so, email me your mailing address and I'll send this to you, unless you're in Calgary or Bragg Creek, and then I'll meet you and bring it.
And Flora, I should say, Cows and Fish, as part of the Native Trout Collaborative, we have some beautiful native trout hats that we've had made. However, they cannot be purchased, they can only be given away. And I think given that we did talk about one of our native trout species, the bull trout today, and native trout habitat, I think it'd be appropriate if you drew another name, whether they're here or not. And if you get that name to me, I could send them a hat.
Fantastic. I'll see. I'm going to see if I can rerun this as we speak. It's like it's kind of fun. It's like a little wheel. Okay, it's about to land. Joe F. So Joe is the winner of the toque, and we share offices, so I'll be able to get that toque to him.
It's a ball cap, not a toque, a trucker's hat.
Oh.
I think that with the mesh on the sides. I really wish I had one here to show you. It's a beautiful hat, but I guess Joe will see when it arrives in the mail.
Perfect. Well, thank you everybody for your time. And just to mention, we did record this event, and so the plan is to put it up on the Cows and Fish YouTube channel.